From the West, we go to Southern Africa. Just hours before the official start of the 15th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has defended the country's participation as he makes an argument for the expansion of the bloc. Ramaphosa addressed the nation on the upcoming summit and the country's foreign policy on Sunday night. According to the president, the world had become increasingly complex and fractured, warning that multilateralism was being replaced by the actions of different power blocs. Ramaphosa also touched on dialogue and diplomacy in ending the current conflicts to achieve durable peace. Meanwhile, the BRICS Summit will be attended by more than 20 countries. Now, political analyst and senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo do Carvalho, joins me on the news for more on this. Thank you so much, Gustavo, for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa has talked about how fractured the country is and, of course, the world. And he also talked about multilateralism and its incursion. So what's your take on the president's speech on the country's policy and how he has overemphasized the importance of the policy coming into play? What message do you think is trying to pass across to the international community?
Thank you very much. And I think it was a very important speech for South Africa, especially when we usually see the presidency not being very active when it comes to presenting some of the policies and positions, especially in foreign policy. And I think it provided a unique opportunity for the country to engage internally and to discuss where we are in the world and how do we relate with other countries. So there's a few key messages that we saw that I think are particularly important. One of them is that stressing the importance that many countries are giving now in terms of BRICS, and particularly how developing countries and emerging economies look into BRICS as an opportunity for them to enhance their voice. And for the first time, we see the South African government very openly confirming that it's in favor of an expansion of BRICS, which could, for instance, benefit many other African countries that have shown degree of interest into that. It was also important to say that on the one hand, while President Ramaphosa presented on the importance of BRICS and stated that many agreements will be signed during this week, especially with China, the presidency also spoke quite at length in terms of the relationship with Western countries, particularly the United States, confirming that the African Growth and Opportunity Act summit that is expected to happen in South Africa before the end of the year will indeed happen, but also announced that South Africa is going to be hosting a summit with the European Union also in 2023. All of those provide a fairly recent space within South African foreign policy where it's trying to clarify more its position, it's trying to become a bit more pragmatic. It's still probably very early to tell, but I think it is a very important development in terms of ensuring that countries from the global south are still able to navigate around very divisive international politics, especially when it's very difficult to present a position now of non-aligned, of not taking sides in global conflicts.
All right, let's talk about the alignment and non-alignment because that's been a bit of a challenge. Now, what could be the possible implications for countries, for that particular country's position, that is South Africa, both on political and economic relations with those countries that are against the non-alignment?
It's been an interesting process in South Africa, especially because the narrative around non-alignment often didn't quite match reality. So I think the main problem that many Western countries in particular had with South Africa wasn't necessarily the statement of a non-alignment, was because while South Africa stated was non-aligned, there was a perception that was being created that South Africa was very close to Russia. What we've seen in the last 3 months, and I think particularly with the African Peace Initiative that went to Ukraine and St. Petersburg 2 months ago, we started seeing that very slow shift in terms of South African positioning. So on the one hand, it's still engaging with Russia, it's still engaging with its partners within BRICS, but engaging very closely also with Western counterparts. If we see the number of senior delegations from South Africa that went to the United States in the coming months, a lot of them had to do with the fact that South Africa does have is a democratic space, but it's also a very loud democratic space where different voices and views often become very hard for analysts like myself to fully understand. And in that regard, we're starting to see a slightly more understanding around this. Though, of course, there is a lot of unresolved issues and a lot of confidence that it still needs to be built. But to a certain degree, I think the issue of non-alignment, and particularly to ensuring, and if we see that South Africa has engaged very actively both with Russia and Ukraine in the last 3 months, and in a way provides a much more genuine understanding that the country is actually pursuing that non-alignment in its own foreign policy.
All right, let's quickly take a look at BRICS. We see that there are some African countries that are submitting applications and some are trying to submit application to be part of the group. We talk about Ethiopia, talk about Tunisia and some other African countries. Is that an act of desperation, or there could be some positives that could come to the African countries if they're able to join the BRICS? So what is your take on that?
I don't think it's an act of desperation. I think in a space where global South countries are desperate for those platforms that can elevate their voices internationally, BRICS to a certain degree became seen as a bit of a symbol of that. So when we look in terms of the types of countries that are mostly that have applied or have indicated interest, we're talking about a very similar category of countries. These are countries from the global South that have very large economies in the region, very influential in the regions, but also countries that are often very underrepresented in global decisions. So we're not only talking about Egypt or Nigeria or Algeria, but we're also talking about Argentina. We're talking about Indonesia. We're talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia. And all of these countries in their own rights have quite a lot of influence in global geopolitical issues, and would like to actually increase their presence by being part of BRICS. I think the big question now within BRICS is not necessarily about an expansion. I think to a certain degree, we should expect BRICS to expand, even if it's very slightly. I think at this stage, the most important aspect is that BRICS members have clarity of the process that will ensure that we know why countries are joining BRICS. We know what they have to gain and to offer to the grouping, but particularly that we don't commit the risk of diluting the group so much that it actually reduces its practical influence. So I think it will be a very interesting few days here in Johannesburg. It will be very interesting to see how the existing member states, there is not a consensus around how this expansion would happen. So there's actually a lot of bilaterals and a lot of meetings between all of the 5 heads of states, including Vladimir Putin, that is going to be joining online to identify what is the way forward and how actually the group can actually become more effective, not less, by looking into an expansion.
Gustavo, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much.